March 19th, 1943. Atlantic Ocean, approximately 200 nautical miles off the coast of Portugal. Lieutenant Commander Donald Mason stood in the cramped cockpit of his PBY Catalina flying boat, peering through the clouds at a churning sea below. At just 150 feet above the waves, dangerously low for a patrol bomber, he could feel every air pocket, every thermal rising from the ocean. The aircraft shuddered constantly, making his already weary crew even more anxious. "Sir, we're too damn low," called his co-pilot, Lieutenant James Whitmore. "Standard Doctrine says we should be at 1,500 feet for optimal radar coverage." Mason didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched the waves, searching for the telltale wake of a submarine periscope or the slight disturbance of a U-boat's conning tower breaking the surface. "Doctrine didn't sink any U-boats last month, Jim," he finally answered. "We're changing the rules. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today." Within 3 hours, Lieutenant Commander Mason would spot, attack, and sink U-537, a German submarine returning to France after a 6-week patrol. The German crew, expecting Allied aircraft to maintain standard patrol altitudes where they could be spotted from miles away, never saw Mason's Catalina until it was directly overhead. By then, it was too late. Mason's daring low-altitude approach would revolutionize anti-submarine warfare tactics, eventually leading to 15 U-boat kills in just 21 days, a devastating blow to German Admiral Karl Dönitz's Atlantic submarine force. The sounds of depth charges exploding beneath the waves would mark not just the destruction of one submarine, but the beginning of a fundamental shift in the psychological balance of the Battle of the Atlantic. For German submariners, the ocean, once their invisible highway to destroy Allied shipping, was becoming a trap. The mathematics of this tactical innovation were already being written across the Atlantic, in statistics that would shatter every assumption German U-boat commanders held about their safety, their mission, and their chances of survival. Between 1941 and 1943, German U-boats had sunk over 1,000 Allied merchant vessels, totaling over 6 million tons of shipping. This happy time, as German submariners called it, had threatened to cut Britain's maritime lifeline completely. But by spring 1943, a convergence of new technologies, tactics, and training was about to reverse the tide of the undersea war dramatically. The transformation would begin not with advanced weaponry or breakthrough equipment, but through a simple, counterintuitive change in aircraft patrol altitude, flying dangerously close to the waves instead of high above them. The story of why American pilots began flying too low and how it transformed anti-submarine warfare isn't one of heroic last stands or dramatic ship-to-ship battles. It's a story of tactical innovation, of challenging established doctrine, of understanding the psychology of the enemy, and ultimately, of asymmetric warfare, where seemingly small changes in approach produced catastrophic results for German submarine operations. The evolution began with frustration. By early 1943, Allied anti-submarine aircraft were flying thousands of patrol hours but achieving relatively few sinkings. Despite radar improvements, increased patrol coverage, and better coordination with surface vessels, U-boats continued to ravage Allied shipping. The problem wasn't a lack of contact, but a lack of successful attacks. Aircraft would detect submarines on radar, but by the time they descended from patrol altitude to attack position, the submarines had already crash-dived to safety. U.S. Navy Lieutenant Commander Francis Fogler, analyzing patrol reports at Anti-Submarine Warfare Command in Norfolk, noticed a pattern. Submarines typically spotted aircraft before aircraft spotted submarines. German U-boats employed dedicated lookouts who scanned the skies continuously, particularly during daylight hours. Standard doctrine called for Allied patrol aircraft to fly between 1,000 and 2,000 feet high enough for good radar coverage and visibility, but also high enough to be spotted by submarine lookouts from miles away. Vogler's revolutionary insight came from studying successful attacks. The few aircraft that reported surprise encounters had been flying at unusually low altitudes, typically below 500 feet, sometimes as low as 100 feet above the waves. At these altitudes, aircraft were effectively invisible to submarines until they were nearly overhead, well within attack range. In January 1943, Vogler drafted a memorandum proposing a radical change in patrol tactics. Aircraft should approach suspected submarine positions at wave-top height, using the sea horizon to mask their approach. Radar should be used intermittently only, with final attack approaches conducted visually to prevent radar detection. The proposal met immediate resistance from established naval aviation experts. Flying at such low altitudes over open ocean was dangerous. It increased fuel consumption, reduced radar effectiveness, and put additional strain on pilots and airframes. Captain Daniel Gallery, commander of the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, later recalled the reaction to Vogler's proposal. "The first time I suggested we try this approach, my air group commander told me I was trying to kill his pilots. He reminded me that naval aviators were trained to maintain safe altitudes, particularly over open water where depth perception is notoriously difficult. I reminded him that we weren't killing any U-boats with current tactics, and perhaps we should accept some additional risk to improve results." Despite resistance, by March 1943, desperation to combat the U-boat threat led to authorization of experimental low-altitude patrols. Lieutenant Commander Mason was among the first to fully embrace the new approach. A former commercial airline pilot with extensive experience flying in difficult conditions, Mason understood the risks but believed the potential tactical advantage outweighed them. He began training his squadron in wave-top approaches, sometimes flying as low as 50 feet above the ocean surface during practice runs. The psychological impact on his crews was significant. Many experienced aviators were uncomfortable flying so low over open water, where a moment's inattention or slight miscalculation could send the aircraft crashing into the waves. Navigation became more difficult, as landmarks were fewer and horizon distance was reduced. The constant turbulence caused by thermal effects and air currents just above the water's surface increased crew fatigue and made routine tasks more challenging. But Mason persisted, developing specific protocols to make low-altitude operations safer. Aircraft would approach suspected submarine positions from downwind and downsun, using both wind and light conditions to further mask their approach. Radar would be used in short, occasional sweeps rather than continuously, reducing the chance of detection by submarine radar warning receivers. Most importantly, pilots were trained to maintain precise altitude control through reference to wave patterns and horizon position, rather than relying solely on altimeters that could be inaccurate at extremely low heights. On March 19th, 1943, Mason's persistence paid off. Flying just 150 feet above the Atlantic, his PBY Catalina spotted the conning tower of U-537, approximately 5 miles ahead. Instead of climbing to attack position as Doctrine dictated, Mason maintained his low altitude, adjusting course slightly to approach from the submarine's stern quarter, where visibility for the lookouts was poorest. The German submarine, commanded by Kapitänleutnant Peter Schrey, was running on the surface to recharge batteries after 2 days submerged. Schrey had posted lookouts as required by German naval protocol, but the men were scanning the skies at higher altitudes, following their own doctrine based on typical Allied patrol practices. Mason's aircraft, flying just above the wave tops, remained undetected until it was less than half a mile from the submarine well within weapon release range. By the time a German lookout spotted the approaching aircraft and shouted a warning, Mason's Catalina was already in attack position. The PBY dropped 4 depth charges in a perfect pattern around the diving submarine. 2 explosive charges detonated directly against the U-boat's pressure hull as it attempted to crash dive. U-537 broke apart at a depth of just 100 feet, killing all 45 crew members aboard. The entire engagement, from initial visual contact to sinking, took less than 4 minutes. Mason's after-action report emphasized the effectiveness of the low-altitude approach. German submarine was completely surprised by our aircraft. No evasive action was attempted until we were in optimal attack position. Recommend all ASW patrols adopt similar tactics when weather conditions permit. His report, combined with similar successes by other pilots experimenting with low-altitude approaches, led to a formal change in patrol doctrine by early April 1943. What followed was one of the most remarkable periods in the Battle of the Atlantic. Between April 1st and April 21st, 1943, Allied aircraft using the new low-altitude tactics located and attacked 31 German submarines in the mid-Atlantic. 15 were confirmed sunk, 7 severely damaged, and the remainder forced to abandon their patrol stations. This 21-day period, later dubbed Black April by German naval historians, represented a catastrophic shift in the undersea war. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine force, was stunned by the sudden reversal of fortune. In his war diary entry of April 18th, he wrote, "The situation in the North Atlantic is grave. For the first time, we are experiencing what the British experienced in 1941. Our submarines are being hunted and destroyed at an unprecedented rate by aircraft that seem to appear without warning. Something fundamental has changed in enemy tactics." The change wasn't just in the number of submarines lost, but in the psychological impact on the surviving crews. German submariners, who had previously operated with relative impunity on the surface, now faced a threat they couldn't reliably detect until it was too late to evade. Lieutenant Walter Kienast, one of the few survivors, from U-352, sunk by a B-24 Liberator flying at 200 feet on April 13, 1943, later described the experience, "We had no warning. One moment the sky was clear. The next moment an aircraft was directly overhead dropping depth charges. Our lookouts were experienced men who had served on multiple patrols. They were scanning the skies as trained, but they were looking at the wrong altitude. The aircraft came in so low it was essentially invisible until it crossed our field of view against the clouds. By then, it was already too late." This tactical innovation coincided with several other developments that collectively became known as the April Turning Point in the Battle of the Atlantic. Improved radar systems, the deployment of escort carriers with dedicated anti-submarine aircraft, and the closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap through very long-range patrol aircraft all contributed to the sudden shift in fortunes. But post-war analysis by both Allied and German naval experts concluded that the change in patrol altitude was perhaps the most significant immediate tactical factor. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Captain Samuel Eliot Morrison, the official U.S. Navy historian for World War II, would later write, "The decision to fly anti-submarine patrols at wave-top height rather than at conventional altitudes represented one of those seemingly small tactical changes that produced disproportionately large results. It nullified one of the U-boat's primary defensive advantages, the ability to spot approaching aircraft and dive before being attacked. The German submarine force never fully recovered from Black April. Though submarine operations would continue throughout the war, and occasional successes would still be achieved, the psychological advantage had shifted permanently. German submariners now operated in constant fear of unseen aircraft appearing without warning. Surface operations, necessary for battery charging and crew health, became increasingly dangerous. Defensive measures, such as increased numbers of lookouts and faster crash dive procedures, reduced operational effectiveness but failed to fully counter the new threat. For Allied aircrews, the change in tactics created both opportunities and challenges. Flying at extremely low altitudes was physically demanding and inherently more dangerous than higher altitude patrols. Aircraft losses to non-combat accidents increased temporarily as crews adapted to the new requirements. But the dramatic improvement in combat effectiveness more than justified the additional risks. Lieutenant Commander Mason, whose successful attack on U-537 had helped validate the new approach, continued developing and refining low-altitude tactics throughout 1943. He emphasized the psychological aspects of the approach as much as the physical techniques. The German submariner expects to see us coming from a distance. His entire defensive doctrine is built around early detection and rapid diving. When we appear suddenly, directly overhead, we destroy not just his tactical advantage but his fundamental sense of security. After one such experience, he will never feel safe on the surface again, even when no aircraft are visible. Mason's insight proved prophetic. Interrogations of German U-boat prisoners captured later in 1943 revealed that fear of surprise air attack had become the dominant psychological concern among submarine crews. Kapitänleutnant Heinrich Schonder, captured when U-467 was sunk in September 1943, told interrogators, "We had been warned about aircraft flying very low. We posted additional lookouts and restricted surface operations to absolute minimum time required." Despite these precautions, the aircraft that sank us appeared without any warning. One moment there was nothing, the next moment it was directly above us. This created a sense among the crew that nowhere was safe, that death could come at any moment without warning. The introduction of low-altitude patrol tactics coincided with improvements in aircraft weaponry that made attacks even more lethal. The Mark 24 mine, actually an acoustic homing torpedo code named Fido, entered service in March 1943. Unlike conventional depth charges that required precise placement, the Mark 24 would actively home on submarine propeller noise, following the target even through evasive maneuvers. When dropped from a low-altitude aircraft that had achieved surprise, these weapons were devastatingly effective. By late May 1943, Admiral Dönitz was forced to temporarily withdraw his U-boats from the North Atlantic, acknowledging that current conditions had made operations unsustainable. In a message to his operational commanders on May 24th, he wrote, "The enemy's air superiority is so great that we can no longer fight on the surface without suffering unacceptable losses. We must develop new tactics based on improved underwater capabilities and night surface operations only." The German Navy attempted to counter low-flying aircraft by enhancing anti-aircraft armament on U-boats, installing additional machine guns and even light flak cannons on conning towers. But these measures proved largely ineffective against aircraft that were already in attack position before being detected. The additional weight of defensive armament also slowed crash dive times, sometimes making submarines more vulnerable rather than less. Perhaps more significantly, German engineers began developing snorkel systems that would allow submarines to run diesel engines while submerged just below the surface, reducing the need for full surface operations. but these systems wouldn't be widely deployed until late 1944, far too late to reverse the strategic situation in the Atlantic. For Allied air crews, the success of low-altitude tactics created a virtuous cycle of innovation and improvement. Pilots shared techniques, refined approaches, and developed variations for different aircraft types and weather conditions. By late 1943, experienced crews were experimenting with extreme low-altitude approaches, sometimes as low as 20 or 30 feet above the waves in calm conditions. At such heights, aircraft were effectively invisible to submarine lookouts until they were directly overhead. The technical challenges of flying so low were substantial. Altimeters were not reliable at extremely low altitudes, forcing pilots to judge height visually based on wave patterns and horizon position. Weather conditions affected both visibility and air turbulence, making some days particularly hazardous for low-level operations. Navigation was more difficult, as landmarks were fewer and horizon distance was reduced. The constant turbulence caused by thermal effects and air currents just above the water's surface increased crew fatigue and made routine tasks more challenging. But the results justified the risks. By the end of 1943, Allied aircraft had sunk over 100 German submarines, many through surprise low-altitude attacks. The psychological impact extended beyond the submarines directly attacked. U-boat commanders who never encountered low-flying aircraft nevertheless modified their operations based on reports from those who had, reducing surface time and operational effectiveness even when no actual threat was present. The cultural shift within the Allied air forces was equally profound. What had initially been seen as a dangerous, unorthodox approach became standard doctrine. Training programs were revised to emphasize low-altitude flying techniques. Aircraft modifications strengthened airframes, improved low-altitude performance, enhanced visibility for spotting submarines, were implemented based on operational experience. Most importantly, the mindset shifted from one of patrol and detection to active hunting and surprise attack. By late 1943, the tactical innovation of low-altitude anti-submarine patrols had evolved from experimental technique to standardized doctrine across Allied air forces. What had begun as a desperate measure in the darkest days of the Battle of the Atlantic had transformed into a refined science with specific protocols, specialized equipment, and dedicated training regimens. The revolution in aerial anti-submarine warfare spread beyond the Atlantic theater, influencing operations in the Mediterranean, the Arctic, and eventually the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Mason, whose successful attack on U-537 in March had helped validate the approach, found himself unexpectedly reassigned to Norfolk Naval Air Station in July 1943. His new role wasn't combat but instruction, teaching the techniques he had pioneered to hundreds of pilots who would carry them to every theatre of the war. Mason initially resisted the assignment, preferring frontline service to a teaching position, but Admiral Ernest King personally intervened. "Your methods have saved more ships and cargo than any single squadron could," King reportedly told him. "Now you will multiply that effect by teaching others. This isn't a reward, Commander. It's a strategic necessity." The training program Mason developed became known informally as the Hedgehopper School. Pilots already qualified in anti-submarine aircraft underwent intensive retraining in extreme low-altitude flying techniques. They practiced wave-top approaches in all weather conditions, learned to judge altitude visually without relying on instruments, and developed instincts for detecting the subtle disturbances in water patterns that might indicate a submarine's presence. The physical and psychological demands were extreme. Approximately 20% of pilots initially selected for the program were found unsuitable, not because they lacked flying skills, but because they couldn't manage the intense concentration required for extended periods at dangerous altitudes over open water. Those who completed the training, however, demonstrated dramatically improved success rates against submarine targets. Commander Thomas Pelham, who went through Mason's program in August 1943 before deploying to the Bay of Biscay, later wrote, "Nothing in my previous flight experience prepared me for the intensity of flying 20 feet above Atlantic waves for hours at a time. Every muscle in your body remains tensed. Your eyes burn from constant focus on the horizon and water surface. Your mind cannot wander for even a second." Mason told us on our first day, "If you daydream in this business, you die." Limited to intensive training. Flying at extremely low altitudes over open ocean carried inherent risks that resulted in non-combat losses. Between April and December 1943, 47 Allied aircraft were lost to accidents directly related to low-altitude operations, collisions with waves during poor visibility, structural failures during turbulence, pilot disorientation in challenging conditions. Against these losses, however, the tactics directly contributed to the destruction of over 120 German submarines during the same period. For the German submarine force, the psychological impact continued to deepen through late 1943 and early 1944. U-boat commanders modified their operations extensively, restricting surface time to brief periods during darkness, zigzagging constantly while surfaced, and requiring multiple lookouts dedicated solely to scanning the lowest portions of the sky just above the horizon. These measures reduced operational effectiveness but failed to fully counter the low-altitude threat. Kapitänleutnant Hans Werner Krauss, commanding U-407, wrote in his patrol log in September 1943, "We surface only between 2 and 4 in the morning, and only when absolutely necessary. Even then, the crew is terrified. They no longer talk or smoke on deck, believing that any movement or light might attract the attention of aircraft we cannot see. Every man keeps his eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for shadows moving against stars. We have become prey animals, listening for predators in the darkness." The predator-prey analogy became increasingly apt as the balance of power continued to shift. Allied aircraft crews began to think of themselves as hunters rather than patrollers, actively seeking submarines rather than simply monitoring assigned sectors. This psychological shift manifested in operational changes. Aircraft would loiter near known U-boat transit routes, deliberately position themselves between submarines and safety, and coordinate with surface vessels to drive submarines into killing zones. Lieutenant Harold McCarthy, flying a modified B-24 Liberator with the U.S. Navy's VB-107 squadron, demonstrated the evolution of these tactics on October 12, 1943. Patrolling the Bay of Biscay at dawn, McCarthy spotted a surfaced submarine approximately 15 miles ahead. Instead of immediately attacking, he descended to 20 feet above the waves, circled wide to approach from the direction of the rising sun, and waited. The submarine, U-378, commanded by Korvettenkapitän Ernst August Rehwinkel, was returning to base in Bordeaux after an unsuccessful patrol. Low on fuel and batteries nearly depleted, Rehwinkel had surfaced to make a final dash to safety in French waters. His crew was exhausted after 62 days at sea without sinking a single Allied vessel. McCarthy's Liberator, flying directly into the sun just above the wave-tops, remained undetected until it was less than half a mile from the submarine. When a lookout finally spotted the approaching aircraft, Raywinkle ordered an immediate crash dive, but the submarine had been running on the surface for hours and was not prepared for rapid submersion. McCarthy's perfectly placed depth charges caught U-378 just as it reached periscope depth, rupturing the pressure hull and sending the submarine to the bottom with all 48 crew members. In his after-action report, McCarthy emphasized the psychological aspects of the engagement. The submarine's response indicated they detected us far too late for effective evasion. Their crash dive was hurried and imprecise, suggesting crew fatigue and possibly fear affecting performance. The tactics we've developed are breaking not just submarines but the morale of their crews. By early 1944, the cumulative effect of low-altitude attack tactics, combined with improved radar, sonar, and weapons systems, had fundamentally altered the nature of submarine warfare in the Atlantic. German U-boats, once the hunters, had become the hunted. The psychological transformation of German submarine crews mirrored the tactical reversal from confident predators to nervous prey, constantly scanning for threats they couldn't reliably detect. Admiral Dönitz recognized the strategic implications. In a January 19th, 1944 message to the German Naval High Command, he wrote, "The current situation in the Atlantic has become untenable. Enemy air superiority, particularly their ability to approach undetected at extremely low altitudes, has made conventional submarine operations impossible. We must accelerate development of advanced technologies, snorkel systems, improved underwater propulsion, enhanced anti-aircraft capabilities, if the U-boat arm is to remain relevant." The technological race intensified throughout 1944. German engineers developed the Schnorchel snorkel system, allowing submarines to run diesel engines while submerged just below the surface. This reduced the need for full surface operations and provided some protection against low-flying aircraft. Allied engineers countered with improved radar systems capable of detecting Schnorchel masts, specialized searchlights for night detection, and enhanced magnetic anomaly detectors that could locate submarines even when fully submerged. But the psychological advantage remained firmly with Allied forces. German submariners operating in 1944 knew they were likely to encounter aircraft they couldn't detect until it was too late. This knowledge affected every aspect of their operations, from tactical decisions to crew morale. U-boat commanders became increasingly conservative, avoiding potentially productive patrol areas if they carried increased air threat, limiting surface operations even when tactically advantageous, and abandoning attacks on convoys at the first sign of air activity. The human dimension of this shift was captured in the memoir of Oberleutnant zur See Karl-Heinz Wiebe, who served as executive officer on U-558 during 1944. The men no longer slept properly, even when off watch. They would jerk awake at the slightest unusual sound, convinced it was the noise of approaching aircraft. During necessary surface periods, they would scan the sky constantly, reporting shadows and movements that weren't there. The psychological strain was more destructive than actual combat. We were defeated in our minds before we were defeated at sea. For Allied air crews, the psychological momentum worked in the opposite direction. Initial apprehension about flying at dangerous altitudes gave way to confidence bordering on aggression. Pilots actively sought encounters rather than avoiding them, developed increasingly bold tactics, and competed informally for submarine kills. The culture shifted from defensive patrolling to offensive hunting, with corresponding effects on morale and operational effectiveness. Lieutenant Commander Mason, continuing his work at the Hedgehopper School in Norfolk, observed this transformation in the pilots cycling through his program. When we started in early '43, most aviators thought we were crazy to fly so low. he noted in a training memorandum. By mid-44, they arrive already converted to the approach, eager to learn the finer points. The psychological barrier has been completely overcome. Now our challenge is tempering their aggression with necessary caution. The refinement of low-altitude attack techniques continued throughout 1944, with specialized variations developing for different aircraft types, geographical areas, and weather conditions. Air crews operating from escort carriers developed coordinated patterns with destroyer escorts, creating interlocking search areas that left submarines nowhere to hide. Land-based, very long-range aircraft extended coverage to the mid-Atlantic, eliminating the air gap that had previously provided U-boats with relatively safe transit areas. By summer 1944, the tactical balance in the Atlantic had shifted so dramatically that Admiral Dönitz was forced to fundamentally reconsider the entire U-boat strategy. On July 19th, he issued a directive that effectively abandoned conventional submarine warfare in favor of a desperate holding action. U-boats will remain primarily submerged, operating solely on schnorchel or battery power. Surface operations are authorized only in extreme emergency or under cover of darkness, with exceptional vigilance against air attack. Our primary objective is now preservation of forces until new submarine types with enhanced underwater capabilities become available. The decision reflected the reality that conventional U-boats had become tactically obsolete, primarily due to their vulnerability to low-flying aircraft they couldn't detect in time to evade. The Type XXI Electra boat, with its dramatically improved underwater performance, would eventually provide a theoretical counter to Allied air superiority, but none would become operational before the end of the war in Europe. The irony wasn't lost on Allied naval planners, who had initially resisted the low-altitude tactics as too dangerous and unorthodox. A seemingly simple change in approach height had contributed significantly to neutralizing one of Germany's most potent weapons. Captain Gallery of USS Guadalcanal, an early advocate for the approach, later wrote, "Sometimes the most effective innovations aren't about technology, but about challenging assumptions." We had convinced ourselves that proper anti-submarine patrol meant flying high enough for good visibility and radar coverage. The Germans built their entire defensive doctrine around that assumption. When we questioned it, their whole system collapsed. The human stories behind the statistical victory revealed both the brutal efficiency of modern warfare and the intensely personal nature of combat at sea. Lieutenant William Lynch, flying a TBF Avenger from USS Bogue on April 24, 1944, spotted U-342 running on the surface approximately 60 miles southwest of Ireland. Following standard low-altitude attack procedures, Lynch approached at wave-top height from the submarine's blind spot, achieving complete surprise. His depth charges broke the submarine's back just aft of the conning tower. As the submarine sank rapidly, 7 German sailors managed to escape the stricken vessel. Lynch circled overhead, dropping a rubber life raft, and radioed their position to nearby surface ships. 6 hours later, a British destroyer rescued 3 survivors, the only members of U-342's 48-man crew, to survive. One of those survivors, Maschinenmat Klaus Weber, later corresponded with Lynch after the war. "For years, I hated you for killing my friends. Now I understand you were doing what I would have done in your position. We never saw your aircraft until it was overhead. We never heard it approaching. One moment we were proceeding normally, the next we were fighting for our lives in the water. The ocean became your weapon that day, not just the depth charges." Weber's observation touched on a fundamental truth about the transformation of submarine warfare. The ocean itself had become weaponized through innovative tactics and technologies. What had once provided submarines with their primary protection, the vast, three-dimensional battle space of the ocean, had become a medium through which they could be hunted with increasing effectiveness. Low-flying aircraft had turned the ocean's surface from a submarine's highway to its most vulnerable position. By early 1945, German submarine operations in the Atlantic had been reduced to a token effort. Between January and May 1945, U-boats sank only 32 Allied vessels, while losing 63 of their own. Those few submarines still operating spent the vast majority of their time submerged, surfacing only briefly at night to run schnorchel, making minimal progress toward increasingly irrelevant patrol areas. The Battle of the Atlantic, while not officially over until Germany's surrender in May 1945, had been effectively decided. The legacy of low-altitude anti-submarine tactics extended well beyond the immediate operational impact. Naval aviation doctrine worldwide was transformed by the experience, with implications that would shape Cold War submarine operations for decades. The psychological insights gained about how tactical innovations affected morale and operational effectiveness on both sides influenced military training and planning across multiple domains. Perhaps most significantly, the experience demonstrated how asymmetric advantages could be created not just through superior technology or resources, but through innovative approaches that challenged established assumptions. The German U-boat force, technically sophisticated and tactically proficient, was ultimately defeated not by overwhelming force alone, but by creative thinking that identified and exploited a critical vulnerability in their operational model. For the individual airmen who pioneered and perfected these dangerous tactics, the victory came at considerable personal cost. Flying at extremely low altitudes over open ocean for hours at a time produced physical and psychological strain that many carried long after the war. The constant vigilance required, the physiological stress of maintaining precise control in turbulent conditions, and the knowledge that the smallest error could be fatal, created a unique form of combat fatigue. Lieutenant Commander Donald Mason, whose successful attack on U-537 in March 1943 had helped validate the approach, continued training replacement pilots until the war's end. In his final report to Naval Air Command in April 1945, he wrote, "The men who flew these missions deserve recognition not just for their courage in combat, but for their willingness to challenge conventional wisdom at significant personal risk. They flew in ways they were specifically trained not to fly, at altitudes they were warned were suicidal, because they recognized that innovation was necessary for victory. Their willingness to question doctrine when it proved ineffective represents the finest tradition of American military thinking." The quantitative impact of the tactical innovation was undeniable. Between April 1943 and May 1945, Allied aircraft sank 287 German submarines, many through surprise low-altitude attacks. The vast majority of these kills occurred in conditions where conventional patrol altitudes would have given the submarine sufficient warning to dive before an attack could be delivered. By war's end, German submarine commanders estimated their chances of completing a patrol without being detected by aircraft at less than 20%, a complete reversal from the happy times of 1941 and early 1942. For the surviving German submariners, the psychological impact of these experiences shaped their perspective on modern warfare. Kapitän Leutnant Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders with 25 ships sunk, survived the war and later commanded submarines in the post-war West German Navy. During NATO exercises in the 1950s, he emphasized to new submarine officers the lessons he had learned. Never assume the technological or tactical situation is fixed. The Americans reversed the entire balance of power in the Atlantic, not through superior equipment, but through a simple change in how they used existing aircraft. Always be prepared for your enemy to think differently than you expect. The transformation extended beyond military applications. Commercial aviation incorporated many of the lessons learned from low-altitude anti-submarine operations, particularly regarding weather effects, visual reference techniques, and crew coordination in challenging flight conditions. Search and rescue operations adopted modified versions of the patrol patterns developed for hunting submarines. Maritime law enforcement agencies adapted the approaches for intercepting smugglers and other illegal traffic. By 1945, what had begun as a desperate improvisation had evolved into a systematic approach that influenced multiple domains. The pilots, who had initially questioned the wisdom of flying too low, had created a tactical revolution that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic and established principles that would shape naval aviation for generations. The human story behind this transformation of pilots willing to challenge doctrine, of submariners facing an unexpected threat, of the psychological battle fought alongside the physical one, remained largely untold in official histories that focused on technology and statistics. But for those who experienced it firsthand, the true significance lay in the convergence of innovation, courage, and the willingness to question established wisdom, even at significant personal risk. When the last German submarine surrendered on May 8, 1945, its commander was asked by the boarding British officer what had been the most significant factor in Germany's defeat at sea. His response was simple: "We could deal with your ships. We could even deal with your conventional air patrols. But when your aircraft began appearing without warning directly overhead, the sea belonged to you. We became the hunted, and our defeat was inevitable." The story of why American pilots started flying too low and how it transformed anti-submarine warfare stands as a testament to the importance of tactical innovation in warfare. From Lieutenant Commander Mason's first successful attack on U-537 to the systematic hunting operations of 1945, the evolution represented not just changing methods, but a fundamental shift in approach, from reactive patrolling to proactive hunting, from following doctrine to challenging assumptions, from accepting limitations to creating opportunities. The ocean, once Germany's invisible highway to attack Allied shipping, had become a deadly trap where submarines were hunted with increasingly sophisticated tactics by air crews who had mastered the art of surprise attack. The mathematical certainty of this transformation was written in statistics that told a clear story. The hunters had become the hunted, and the Battle of the Atlantic had been decided not just by technology or resources, but by the willingness to think differently about how to fight an undersea war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.